Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you for listening, as always. This is part 10 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled Unity or Death. I'd like to begin by apologizing for the delay with this episode's release. I had some last-minute adjustments to make to the script that disrupted my production timeline. I'm recording this on Monday, January 13th, and hopefully I'm able to get this episode uploaded by the 15th. As for the Korean War series finale, that release has been further delayed because the computer I had the file on stopped working all of a sudden and I had to wait for it to be repaired, but the editing process has since resumed, and I'm trying to get it out as quickly as I can. One last item of housekeeping at the top of this show: I'm planning to relaunch the show's Patreon later this year. If you listen to some of my older content, you may be aware that the show used to have a Patreon about 3 years ago or so. But after a few months, only 2 people subscribed, and I realized that I may have acted prematurely and suspended the page. By this point though, I think I have enough listeners to where it might be worth another shot. I have some bonus content recorded already, and I have a few other ideas that I'd like to work on, mainly things like interviews, primary source readings, book reviews, listener questions, and so on. If you have any suggestions along these lines, if there are other kinds of content that you'd like to see on the Patreon, or if you have questions you'd like to be featured on the show, or even if you're interested in being interviewed for the show, please feel free to send me an email at perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Right now, my goal is to produce enough content to be able to release 1 bonus episode a month for at least a year, so with everything else I've got going on right now, I'll probably be ready to relaunch the Patreon around the time that the show usually goes into hiatus in June, so stay tuned for further updates. Anyway, let's get on with the show. In the previous episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we mainly covered the events of October 5th and 6th, 1789, known to history as the October Days, and their immediate aftermath. In the weeks leading up to the October Days, many significant revolutionary changes had been introduced to France by the auspices of the National Assembly, including the abolition of feudalism and the ratification of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Despite being compelled to publicly display his support for the revolution, King Louis XVI silently resented these usurpations of his authority. Knowing that his approval was considered necessary to ratify these changes, he refused to sign off on any of them for several weeks. Meanwhile, material conditions in the city of Paris continued to steadily deteriorate. The city faced near-famine conditions as food became increasingly difficult for average people to obtain. Popular unrest mounted, and our protagonist, the Marquis de Lafayette, as Commander-General of the National Guard of Paris, struggled to keep the peace. On the morning of October 5th, 1789, a group of women in the working-class district of Faubourg Saint-Antoine went to the marketplace to find that there was no bread available to be purchased. Arming themselves with pitchforks, kitchen knives, and whatever else they had on hand, thousands of enraged women converged on Paris City Hall, the Hôtel de Ville, before pressing on to Versailles to lodge their complaints with the king. Lafayette's attempts to disperse this demonstration were thwarted by his own men, who openly sympathized with the protesters. They refused to follow his orders and insisted that he lead them in joining the march on Versailles. They threatened to mutiny if he did not comply, and so Lafayette, under the belief that his leadership was the only way to ensure things did not devolve into a senseless massacre, complied. The situation was tense as Lafayette and the National Guard approached Versailles just before midnight that evening. The mob had taken over the meeting hall of the National Assembly and were at the gates of the palace. By the time Lafayette had arrived, the king already conceded to some of the people's demands in the hopes of diffusing the situation. The king's bodyguards were apprehensive of Lafayette's intentions, unsure if he had come to defend the king or depose him. Indeed, Lafayette was in a position where he could have taken the palace by storm and forced the king's abdication, but he remained loyal as ever to his sovereign. In fact, he forced his men to renew their oaths of loyalty to the king before they reached the palace. Lafayette was allowed to enter the royal apartments where he was granted an audience with the king. After offering Louis his reassurances that he had come to protect him and his family from harm, Lafayette then spent the rest of the night ensuring that the palace grounds were secure. Once he was certain the danger had passed, Lafayette went to his in-laws' residence and promptly collapsed from exhaustion. he was awoken less than an hour later to reports that protesters had somehow managed to find their way into the palace and were scouring the building in search of the royal family. Certain that a grisly fate would await them if the mob managed to seize them, Lafayette immediately rode to the rescue. Rushing into the palace with a contingent of National Guards, he saved a few of the king's bodyguards from being torn apart by the frenzied mob before locating the apartments where the king, queen, and their children were hiding. With their immediate safety ensured, Lafayette then attempted to mediate the conflict. He led the king onto the balcony to face his subjects below. They were met with demands for the royal family to relocate to Paris. They wished for the king to live among his subjects so that he could be accountable to them, and could no longer turn a blind eye to their suffering. The king and queen were both quite hesitant to make such a move. Living at Versailles, they had felt safe from the revolutionary upheavals in Paris. But as that morning's events had demonstrated, they were no safer in Versailles than they were anywhere else. The mob refused to disperse until the king complied with their demand, making it clear that they would not return to Paris without him. Faced with little recourse, Louis acceded. Over the course of the rest of that day, Lafayette oversaw the relocation. This involved not only moving the royal family and their belongings, but also the king's ministers, courtiers, and servants. The National Assembly also relocated to Paris at this time. The net effect of all of this was that Versailles, which had effectively served as the French capital for over a century, was left practically abandoned overnight. The seemingly endless procession of people, horses, and carriages reached Paris around 6 o'clock that evening. After the king and queen gave some formal remarks to the municipal government of Paris and to the general public, Lafayette saw to it that they were moved into their new residence at the Tuileries Palace. The massive Renaissance-era palace complex near the center of the city was surrounded by National Guards day in and day out. The king and queen felt that this drab, dilapidated building was effectively a prison, and they were not totally unreasonable to think this way. One has to bear in mind that the most significant consequence of the October days was that the king was rendered all but entirely powerless. Sure, he was still the head of state, the hereditary chief magistrate, as it were, but this was little more than a polite fiction. So long as he remained in Paris, he had no real authority. For the time being, he could do little else but make occasional appearances before the National Assembly, whose deputies now convened a short walk away in the Salle du Manège. There he would declare how pleased he was to be in Paris, that the move here had been of his own free will, that he approved of the Declaration of Rights and the abolition of feudalism, and so on. He was on their side, or so he wanted them to believe. This, too, was nothing more than a polite fiction on the king's part, as was, for that matter, his friendship with Lafayette. As I touched on in the previous episode, discerning what the king's perception of his situation was at any given point between 1789 and 1791, let alone how it changed through this period, is quite fraught. A declaration ostensibly authored by Louis, dated June 20th, 1791, posits that he regarded himself as a prisoner of the state from practically the moment he set foot in the Tuileries. Quote, "It was to the National Guard of Paris that the safety of the king was entrusted. These troops are entirely under the orders of the municipality of Paris, to which the Commander-General reports. The king, therefore, was made a prisoner in his own kingdom, for how else can we call a king who commands his guard for only ceremonial matters, and who is obliged to see himself surrounded by several people whom he knows have bad intentions for him and his family?" End quote. Was our protagonist one of these ill-intended people that Louis felt threatened by? Possibly. The wording is somewhat unclear, at least to me. Queen Marie Antoinette's feelings about Lafayette during this time are far less ambiguous. She had long been distrustful of the Marquis and hardly made a secret of it. She did not believe his story that he had been compelled to march on Versailles, and readily believed the rumors that made their way through royalist circles that Lafayette had orchestrated the whole affair, with the ultimate goal of usurping her husband's throne. Although he himself was very nearly killed at several points during the October days, it is true that Lafayette could hardly have hoped for a more favorable outcome for himself at the end of it all. He emerged from the crisis more famous and powerful than ever before. Not only was the immediate security of the king and his family Lafayette's responsibility as Commander-General of the National Guard of Paris, but Louis had also extended his jurisdiction to include all military forces within a 45-mile radius of the capital. Lafayette's role as the royal guardian ostensibly afforded him a great deal of influence over the nominal head of state. One must also consider that throughout this time he was still a deputy of the National Assembly, and that he continued to enjoy the status of a popularly acclaimed revolutionary icon. All of this is to say that Lafayette was in such an ascendant position after the October days, it's understandable why many observers began to speculate he may have been harboring ulterior motives. But as I've said before, and will probably say again, Lafayette never had any designs on dictatorship. In fact, he abhorred the concentration of too much civil and military authority in one figure, even if that figure was to be himself. His friend and confidant, the American statesman Governor Maurice, was concerned that Lafayette was in danger of overextending himself, writing in his diary, quote, "The Marquis cannot possibly act as a minister and soldier, much less the minister of every department," end quote. The Marquis shared this sentiment, though for not the same reasons as Maurice, as I'll explain shortly. At some point in late 1789, Lafayette was invited to become president of the National Assembly. He turned the invitation down, stating, quote, "All I want for the nation is liberty, order, and a good constitution. I believe that is what the nation wants as well, and I hope that we will reach our goal. My present job is to ensure public tranquility and, in my role as a member of the National Assembly, to strengthen our liberties and to protect the king and queen from the conspiracies against them." End quote. Lafayette never lost sight of his vision of a constitutional monarchy, and his single-minded dedication to realizing this vision was every bit as vexing to those who feared his ambition as it was to those who sought to encourage it. One person who fell into the latter category was actually Governor Maurice, who thought that his decision to decline the presidency was a naive mistake. As he wrote in a letter to George Washington, quote, "Our friend Lafayette has given into measures as to the Constitution which he does not approve of, and he approves of many things which experience will demonstrate to be injurious. He left America, you know, while his education was yet half finished. What he learned there he does well, but he did not learn how to make a government." End quote. Maurice's contention here was not that Lafayette should try to accrue greater power for himself per se, but that he should accrue this power and then delegate it to politically reliable ministers. Maurice even provided Lafayette with a helpful list of men who might form his cabinet. Coincidentally, all the people on this list were allies and associates of Maurice, the most prominent among whom was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Bishop of Autun and a deputy of the National Assembly. He's more often than not referred to as simply Talleyrand, and over the years his name has become a byword for unscrupulousness and opportunism. His career would span several decades and multiple regime changes, this longevity owing itself to his uncanny political instinct. He found Lafayette's unwillingness to play the game of politics, as it were, incredibly frustrating. Both he and Maurice met with Lafayette a few times in October and November 1789, but their discussions ultimately went nowhere, leaving Talleyrand to conclude that Lafayette appeared to have no fixed plan, later observing in his memoirs that Lafayette's fault was not a lack of ambition, but that, quote, "his efforts to distinguish himself do not seem to be his own, but rather to have been taught to him. Whatever he does seems foreign to his true nature. He acts as though he follows someone else's advice." End quote. Of course, the example Lafayette constantly sought to emulate was that of his mentor, George Washington. One important thing the general had imparted to his young protege was an antipathy towards political factionalism, which he saw as an inherently destabilizing force in a democratic form of government. Washington would present this argument most famously in his 1796 farewell address. One relevant excerpt reads as follows, quote, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it." End quote. These remarks may have been delivered some 7 years further down the line, but Washington's distrust of factions and parties was a well-established one, and this was a lesson that Lafayette had very much taken to heart. These sentiments are apparent in a letter that he wrote to Washington on New Year's Day, 1790. The letter reads in part, quote, "My dear General, how often I have wanted your wise advice and friendly support. We have come thus far in the Revolution without breaking the ship of state on either the shoal of aristocracy or faction, and in the midst of ceaseless opposition by partisans of the past and ambitious men, we are marching forward towards a reasonable conclusion. Now that everything that was is no more, a new political edifice is erecting, far from perfection, but still sufficient to ensure freedom. I hope my adventures will turn to the advantage of my nation and of mankind in general. Liberty is springing up around us in all other parts of Europe. I shall encourage their development by every means in my power." End quote. Here, we can observe something that I touched on in episode 7. Lafayette presupposed that the principles of democratic governance were universal, that because Washington decried the very notion of political parties in America, he should do the same in France. Call this what you will, naivete, idealism, what have you, but in any case, it would sow the seeds of his downfall. Talleyrand was not the only powerful figure hoping to hitch his fortunes to Lafayette's star in the period immediately following the October days. Between October 1789 and April of the following year, no less a figure than Mirabeau tried to forge an alliance with him. I provided a lengthy introduction to Mirabeau, whose full name and title was Honoré Gabriel Riquetti de Comte de Mirabeau, when he first entered our narrative in episode 7. Perhaps I should have waited a bit longer, but for the listener's sake, I'll briefly recap the most important biographical details here. To say that Mirabeau was a complicated figure would be putting it mildly. He was born in 1749 as the scion of a noble family of some renown from the region of Provence in southeastern France. A dissolute youth, Mirabeau spent his early years becoming involved in near-constant scandals, typically involving women, and spending long stints of time either in prison or in exile abroad. All the while, he accumulated an enormous mountain of debt. Keep that last part in mind as we go on. And yet, for all his faults, Mirabeau was, by all accounts, a political genius. Like many of his contemporaries like Georges Danton, Camille Desmoulins, and Jean-Paul Marat, Mirabeau was a skilled orator. His rhetoric in the National Assembly had won him a great deal of revolutionary credibility. Even prior to the revolution, he had demonstrated his ability to win over the masses in his native Provence, earning him the unofficial title of Tribune of the People. What truly set Mirabeau apart, however, was his ability as a political theorist. Stirring the masses to action was one thing, but being able to understand the workings of revolutionary politics, to formulate clear plans, and possessing the will to enact them, these were all different things entirely. In marked contrast to many of his compatriots in the Jacobin Club, of which he was technically a member until his death, Mirabeau's goals were far more pragmatic. Historian Simon Schama summarizes Mirabeau's vision for the revolution's end in the following terms, quote, "A constitutional monarchy that accepted the conquests of 1789, but without resigning itself to becoming a passive instrument of the legislature. He was, as he wrote to an associate, in favor of the establishment of order, not of the old order." End quote. Initially, Mirabeau had been allied with the Duc d'Orléans, but when he was ignominiously shuffled off the political stage after the October days, Mirabeau sought out new allies. And who better than the most powerful man in the country at that moment, the Marquis de Lafayette? And so, beginning in October 1789, Mirabeau began to meet with and correspond frequently with Lafayette in the hopes of forming an alliance with him. Mirabeau's case for such a partnership was admittedly rather strong. With his political ability and Lafayette's military leadership, he argued that by joining forces the two would be in an advantageous position from which to direct the course of the revolution towards an end state that he knew Lafayette desired as well. Invoking the 17th century statesman Cardinal Richelieu, Mirabeau implored Lafayette to, quote, "become a Richelieu over the court for the nation, and you will make the monarchy anew, while enlarging and consolidating the public liberty." End quote. He urged Lafayette to consider his advice, arguing that he possessed a clearer understanding of the political situation than any of the mediocre men, his words not mine, that he considered his friends and allies. Quote, "You have a number of friends, though fewer than you think, but not one of them has value and virtue of a certain kind. They are one and all totally ignorant of human nature and of the real feelings of the country. I am a great deal more necessary to you than all of them put together." End quote. As I mentioned in episode 7, from the time that he first met Mirabeau at some point prior to the Estates General, Lafayette both disliked and distrusted him. Certain that Mirabeau's motives were not as righteous as he let on, Lafayette was unreceptive to his advances. He did continue to meet with him and correspond with him for several months, but he tried his best to keep him at arm's length. Mirabeau was persistent, and he was not above using flattery in his efforts to win over the hero of two worlds. The following quote comes from a letter that he wrote to Lafayette, dated October 19th. Quote, "Whatever happens, I shall be yours unto the end, because your great qualities have strongly attracted me, and it is impossible for me not to take such a lively interest in a future such as yours, and one that is so strictly bound to the revolution that leads the nation to liberty." End quote. Still, Lafayette continued to resist his entreaties. He is alleged to have stated, quote, I overcame the might of the King of England, the authority of the King of France, and the unleashed fury of the people. I certainly shall not surrender to Mirabeau." End quote. This back and forth between Lafayette and Mirabeau would continue until April 1790, at which time their relationship devolved into outright and mutual animosity. During one of his regular meetings with the king and queen, the pair urged Lafayette to come to an agreement with Mirabeau, saying, quote, "We feel the utmost confidence in you, but you are so completely absorbed in the duties of your place that it is impossible for you to suffice for everything. We must therefore make use of a man possessing talent and activity who can do what you, for want of time, cannot do yourself. We are convinced that Mirabeau is the person best suited for this place, by his influence, talents, and the habit that he has acquired in managing the affairs of the Assembly. We therefore desire that you should agree to concert with Mirabeau, respecting the subjects most important to the welfare of the state and our person." End quote. Left unsaid in this appeal was the fact that the king and queen had themselves come to an understanding with Mirabeau. In exchange for a rather hefty retainer of 200,000 livres and a monthly salary of 6,000 livres, the perennially indebted Mirabeau agreed to offer the court advice on how to recover some degree of royal authority and to act in their interests within the National Assembly. Of course, the agreement between Mirabeau and the king was kept hidden from the public, and it would remain so until Louis's trial in 1792. It's highly unlikely that Louis would have let Lafayette in on this secret in April 1790. In response to the request that he should work with Mirabeau, Lafayette replied, quote, "I do not like him, I do not esteem him, I do not fear him, I see no reason why I should seek an understanding with him." End quote. This remark was promptly passed along to Mirabeau, and from that moment until his last day, he would regard Lafayette as his mortal enemy. Mirabeau became one of his fiercest critics. In the memorandums written to the king and queen, he cautioned them against Lafayette, playing to their suspicions that he intended on usurping royal authority for himself. He issued similar warnings in the Assembly, saying, quote, "As for a plan, he has none. As for means, those he receives from the hands of each new day. His policy is to create such a fermentation in everyone about him that he is allowed to retain power and extend the influence of Paris over the entire kingdom." End quote. Again, the great irony in all of this is that Mirabeau and Lafayette were after the same thing, and that by spurning Mirabeau, he had just turned away perhaps the one man who might have been able to successfully reform the monarchy along the lines of a constitution. During this time, though, that is to say, late 1789 into early 1790, there was no reason to believe that the king would not eventually see reason and embrace the changes brought about by the Revolution. Lafayette's outlook was rather positive. Another quote from his New Year's letter to George Washington, quote, "As regards the political situation of France, we have made more changes in 10 months than even the most sanguine patriot could have imagined. Our internal troubles and anarchy are both very much exaggerated, and upon the whole, this revolution will soon want for nothing." End quote. Lafayette's optimism was not unfounded, at least so far as his immediate situation was concerned. The unrest on the streets of Paris had somewhat subsided after the October days, though there were sporadic disturbances. The annual harvest was better than it had been the past 2 years, which made the National Guard's job of ensuring the city was adequately provisioned a bit easier. Still, this was a fragile piece, as one incident in mid-October demonstrated. On the morning of the 21st, a baker, who announced that he was out of bread, was accused of hoarding and was killed on the spot by an angry mob. Maurice reported the incident in his journal, quote, "There's been hanged this morning a baker by the populace, and all Paris is under arms." The poor man was beheaded and according to custom was carried in triumph through the streets. His wife was said to have died in horror when they presented her with her husband's head affixed to a pole. Paris is perhaps as wicked a place as exists. Murder, fraud, rapine, oppression, baseness, and cruelty all abound here. And yet this is the city which stepped forward in the sacred cause of liberty. The pressure of the previous despotism removed, every bad passion now exerts its peculiar energy. How this will end, heaven knows." End quote. Lafayette found the incident to be every bit as upsetting. All the more so when he learned that members of the National Guard had been at the scene of the crime but had done nothing to stop it. At a meeting of his officers, Lafayette lectured them on the gravity of their mission. Quote, "All is lost if the Guard continues to conduct itself in this way. We are the only foot soldiers of the Revolution, the only protectors of the royal family. We alone must establish the freedom of the nation's representatives. We alone must safeguard the public good. The eyes of France and all Europe are affixed on Paris. Any attack on these sacred institutions would dishonor us forever." End quote. Of all the factors contributing to the continued unrest in Paris at this time, Lafayette believed that the radical press was the most responsible. In particular, he set his sights on the one journalist he considered the most dangerous, Jean-Paul Marat. In the pages of his newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, or Friend of the People, Marat constantly incited the public to violence, raising the specter of counter-revolution and branding those whom he thought to be insufficiently radical as agents of reaction. In this final case, he was among those who warned that Lafayette was a tyrant in the making, writing of him, quote, "Since getting himself named general of the citizen militia, he has thought only of using popular favor for his own advancements, to trade the rights of the people with the court, and to turn public power against the nation." End quote. In an August 1790 edition of the paper, Marat defended his uncompromising and vituperative form of journalistic practice in the following terms. Quote, "Everything is permitted to shake the people from its deadly lethargy, to recall to it the sense of its rights, and to inspire it with the courage to defend them. One cannot be a troublemaker when one cries out only for the nation's interest." End quote. Marat's violent rhetoric tested the limits of what more moderate liberals like Lafayette were willing to tolerate in the name of freedom of speech and of the press, both rights which were enumerated in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. A Parisian court issued an arrest warrant for Marat in October 1799, but for whatever reason Lafayette declined to act on the warrant for another 3 months. By January, he had reached the conclusion that Marat was disturbing the public order with his words, and resolved to take him into custody. On January 22nd, 2 companies of the National Guard were sent into the Cordelier district to execute the warrant for Marat's arrest. They were met with resistance from the unofficial leader of the district, Georges Danton, who refused to hand Marat over. A standoff ensued, and Lafayette, not wanting to risk a bloodbath, stood down. Marat managed to slip away, and from hiding he published a scathing rebuke in L'Ami du Peuple, ridiculing the extreme lengths the National Guard had taken to arrest him. Addressing Lafayette directly, he sarcastically insinuated that the 50 or so grenadiers who had burst into his home to arrest him for exercising his right to free expression could not possibly have been acting on the orders of the heroic defender of liberty. Quote, "You, sir, on whom the confidence of the nation rests, should instill some sentiment of restraint in your troops. If this tribunal can make your soldiers oppress the people with impunity, and without your consent, who will stop them from using the nation's forces against the public? What will become of your functions as Commander General? What then will the nation, which regards you as its avenger, think of you?" End quote. He concluded this article with a personal challenge to Lafayette to, quote, "justify in the eyes of the nation the sincerity of the patriotic sentiments that you profess." End quote. Before the year was out, he would arguably do precisely that. Throughout the country, a remarkable transformation was taking place. France was in the process of becoming something that we today would recognize as a modern nation-state. Under the Ancien regime, the kingdom had been divided arbitrarily into a complex patchwork of feudal provinces, where the jurisdictions of taxation, justice, the military, and the church often overlapped with each other. The National Assembly sought to do away with this irrational administrative structure and replace it with a new system that divided the country into 83 departments, each of roughly identical size and with the same enumerated powers. This would have the effect of streamlining matters of administration, but moreover, it was hoped that by breaking up France's historical provinces, citizens might begin to identify more strongly with the nation than with their particular region. The decree enacting this change went into effect on December 22nd, 1789, and at least in the immediate term it was quite well received. As communal governments across the country implemented this and other new laws from the National Assembly, citizens of different municipalities banded together to form federations, fraternal associations intended to promote national unity. Many of these federations organized festivals celebrating the triumph of the Revolution and this growing sense of national solidarity. Modern historians are quite sure that the Federation movement emerged spontaneously in the first half of 1790, and that these celebrations were genuine. Proposals were made for a general federation to be held in Paris as a nationwide expression of unity. The Paris Commune voted to organize such an event, dubbed the Festival of the Federation, and on June 21st, the mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, presented their proposal before the National Assembly. Quote, "Gentlemen, a new order of things is emerging, and will regenerate all parts of the realm. Our unity is our strength. Division among the provinces and their people has vanished. There is now only one duty, that of submission to the law and the king. There is only one sentiment, that of love and fraternity. I entreat all our brothers to come, as deputies of districts and departments, to join us within our walls, in our presence, to add to the civic oath already sworn by all the French, that of being indivisibly united, to love each other and to always help each other, as the need arises, from one end of the realm to the other." End quote. The way Bailly envisioned it, the National Guard would play an important role in this festival, as representatives from each National Guard company from each department would participate. Quote, "The zeal, courage, and patriotism of the National Guard are everywhere admired. We can judge here by the Guard of Paris. We see that it is civic virtue that has made them take up arms. We recognize a citizen general that commands an army of citizens." End quote. The central event was to be the swearing of a sacred oath to the nation, as he described, quote, "The citizens, with all the soldiers of liberty and all the military, would join with the king of a free nation to swear with him to maintain the Constitution so long as the sentiment of liberty and the enlightenment of reason continue to exist among men." End quote. The Assembly approved the Commune's proposal for the Festival of the Federation without hesitation, though a major problem immediately arose. The proposed date for the festival was, of course, July 14th, the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. This meant that all the preparations had to be made in under 3 weeks. The site chosen for the ceremony was the Champ de Mars, a large field running from the École Militaire to the Seine River that was used as a parade ground by officer cadets. Today, the Champ de Mars is better known as the site of the Eiffel Tower. The plans called for the entire field to be transformed into a massive Roman-style amphitheater built in 30 tiers to accommodate the number of spectators that were anticipated. At the field's northern entrance was to be constructed a triumphal arch that had to be sufficiently wide for 3 columns of soldiers to enter simultaneously. And finally, at the center was to be the altar of the fatherland from where the oath was to be administered. There was quite a lot of preliminary work that had to be done before any of this construction could commence. For one, heavy rains at the end of June had inundated much of the field, requiring drainage ditches to be dug, and for large quantities of sand and gravel to be spread out on the ground to make it firm enough to walk on, let alone build on. Huge rocks that littered the field had to be broken up and hauled away, the surrounding streets had to be widened for the procession, and so on and so forth. The Assembly put out a call for volunteers, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands answered the call. A great many of these were previously unemployed workers from the city, but remarkably, a significant number of nobles and clergy also opted to share in this labor. First-hand accounts emphasize the egalitarian nature of this undertaking, sketching scenes of people from all classes, invigorated by revolutionary fervor and love for their fellow man, working together in harmony day in and day out. The dramatist Louis-Sébastien Mercier wrote of these scenes in his typical sentimental fashion. Quote, "It was there in the Champ de Mars that I saw 150,000 citizens of all classes, ages, and sexes, making the most superb picture of accord, labor, movement, and joy that has ever been witnessed. What fine and splendid citizens of Paris, who could transform 8 days of work into the most touching festival that has ever been. It is a type of spectacle so unique that even the most blasé of men could hardly fail to be moved." End quote. Lafayette, preoccupied as he was in those days with organizational matters, couldn't resist the call to pick up a spade and pitch in at the construction site for a few hours at a time. Even the king made an appearance one day to mingle with the laborers and swing a pickaxe performatively, a photo opportunity that Lafayette almost certainly helped to curate. Throngs of people from across the country made their way to the capital as the day of the festival approached. The National Guard of each of the 83 departments of France sent a company of men to represent them at the festival. Contemporary sources placed the total number of these fédérés, as members of the National Guard serving outside of Paris were called, at 14,000. Thousands more civilians came along for the chance to participate in this once-in-a-lifetime event. On July 10th, 4 days before the event, the fédérés assembled in front of the Hôtel de Ville and declared themselves to be the Assembly of the Federation. Lafayette was unanimously acclaimed as their president. He had each company elect from its ranks 2 men to act as delegates, and the next day he took these fédérés to the Tuileries to pay homage to the king. Lafayette read to Louis a statement that he had prepared for the occasion. Quote, "We wish to venerate your majesty with the most beautiful of all titles, that of Chief of the French and the King of a free people. Rejoice, sire, in the prize of your virtue. Let this be an expression of genuine homage which despotism could never elicit, and let it be the glory and recompense of a citizen king." End quote. The king's reply, which Lafayette later said he found to be quite heartfelt and touching, was, in part, quote, "Tell your fellow citizens that I would have liked to tell them all what I am telling you here, that the king is their father, their brother, and their friend, that he can only be happy when they are happy, when they are free, and when they prosper." End quote. At dawn on July 14th, 1790, the 14,000 fédérés, joined by 36,000 of their comrades belonging to the National Guard of Paris, mustered at the Place de Bastille. The sky was gray and a steady rain was falling, which would continue throughout most of the day. But in spite of their drenched uniforms, at 8 a.m. sharp they began marching westward through the city streets toward the Champ de Mars. Along their route, citizens of Paris turned out to cheer on the soldiers, offering them flowers and singing the revolutionary anthem Ça ira as they passed. At the Place de la Concorde, then known as the Place Louis XV, they were met by the deputies of the National Assembly, who joined them for the final 2 miles of the procession. It was around 1 in the afternoon when they finally arrived at the Champ de Mars to the thunderous roar of the multitude already gathered there. The inauspicious weather had not had a dampening effect, pardon the pun, on attendance. There were between 350 and 400,000 spectators there, depending on the source. The Fédéré companies from each department processed to the elaborately decorated altar of the fatherland, standing at the center of the field. There, the man in each company who had been designated as their standard bearer deposited the regimental banner at the altar, while the rest of the company drew itself into its ranks on the field. Lafayette, riding his conspicuous white horse, directed the troops' movements. The next order of business was a religious ceremony. Talleyrand, who was still an ordained bishop, volunteered to say the Mass. He, along with 200 other clergy, all dressed in their liturgical vestments with tricolor sashes across their torsos, stood at the altar for nearly 2 hours, waiting for the procession to conclude. Finally, around 3 p.m., everyone was in place. Talleyrand was a bit out of practice, having not said Mass in quite some time. Before the proceedings began, he allegedly turned to one of his underlings and told him not to do anything that might make him laugh. The Bishop of Autun was able to make it through the liturgy without botching it. At the end, he raised his hands over the regimental standards for the benediction, proclaiming, quote, "Sing and weep with tears of joy, for on this day France has been made anew." End quote. The occasion having been duly consecrated, Talleyrand gave the stage over to Lafayette. He ascended the stairs to the top of the altar from which he would administer the oath. Then, as if on cue, the rain stopped, and sunlight began to peer out from behind the storm clouds. With one hand raised and his sword in the other, Lafayette read aloud the oath and asked everyone to repeat after him. Quote, "We swear to be forever faithful to the nation, to the law, and to the king, to uphold with all our might the Constitution as decided by the National Assembly and accepted by the king, and to remain united with all French people by the indissoluble bonds of brotherhood." End quote. Obviously, his words could only be heard by those closest at hand, so the oath had to be read by others in the crowd simultaneously. The following description comes from the official report of the festival commissioned by the National Assembly. Quote, "At the same moment every hand was raised and every voice exclaimed, 'Yes, I swear it.' The oath, which each person repeated multiple times, was followed by discharges of artillery and cries of 'Long live the National Assembly,' 'Long live the King,' and 'Long live Lafayette.'" End quote. When the noise subsided, the king was next to speak. Using his new title of King of the French for the first time in public, he likewise swore to, quote, "employ all the power delegated to me to uphold the decrees of the National Assembly." End quote. Even the Queen had her moment, holding aloft the young Dauphin dressed in a miniature National Guard uniform to thunderous applause. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. Still, the undisputed star of the day was Lafayette. Newly appointed U.S. Minister to France, William Short wrote a letter to his friend and mentor Thomas Jefferson with some of his observations. Quote, "The Marquis de Lafayette seems to have taken full possession of the National Guard. His popular manners pleased them beyond all measure, and they of course approved his principles. When I left Paris he was adored by them. That moment may be regarded as the zenith of his influence." End quote. A lot of first-hand accounts of the festival trend towards exaggeration. British journalist Helen Maria Williams, who referred to the festival as, quote, "the most sublime spectacle I ever hoped to behold, the true faith revealed at its most ecstatic," end quote, stated that the day's events had shown Lafayette to be, quote, "he who is justly the idol of the French nation," end quote. Another spectator remarked, quote, "There you are witnessing Monsieur Lafayette galloping into the pages of history," end quote. A report published in Camille Desmoulins's newspaper, La Révolution de Paris, crossed the line into satire. Quote, 10,000 of the National Guards dashed towards Lafayette, some kissing his face, others his hands, and the more unfortunate among them his uniform. It had only been with great difficulty that he managed to remount his horse. If there had been an election right then and there, popular folly might have leveraged on the Marquis's horse the honors the Roman Emperor Caligula bestowed on his own in a fit of despotic frenzy." End quote. The Comte de Mirabeau certainly did not find the whole affair amusing. Prior to the festival, he wrote a memorandum to the king cautioning against Lafayette's ambition. Quote, "Master of the National Guard, and by that army able to dispose of the executive power. If the ministers devoted to his ambition do not refuse his influence, will he not be the most absolute, most formidable dictator?" End quote. The events of July 14th seemed to support his argument that Lafayette was a dictator in the making, specifically in the way that the king was relegated to the sidelines while Lafayette used the event to further enhance his own profile. Quote, "It is useless to point out to what degree the king has compromised himself without profit, and to what extent we have made Lafayette the man of the French nation, the unique man, the man of the provinces." End quote. Lafayette would soon after prove Mirabeau's concerns to be totally unfounded. Amid the celebratory atmosphere that pervaded Paris in the week following the Festival of the Federation, Lafayette was offered, by general acclamation of the Fédérés, overall command of all National Guard companies throughout the country. The following is an excerpt from the speech approved by the deputies of the Assembly of the Federation to Lafayette, asking him to become their commander-in-chief. Quote, "Sir, he who, at the moment when the Constituent Assembly was threatened with the vengeance of despotism, dared to speak of the rights of man as a free man himself, he who had cooperated in so glorious a manner in the revolution of the New World, ought undoubtedly to devote himself to the one his own fellow citizens have so lately achieved, and prove himself to be also the friend and defender of liberty. But you, who have done so much for the public cause, have determined to receive no recompense. You have refused the homage prepared for you by the hearts of our grateful citizens. You withdrew from our applause and testimonies of affection, and you have shown us that a great man never conceives that he has done enough for his country. The deputies of the National Guards of France will retire with the regret of not having been able to appoint you their chief. They will respect the constitutional law, which arrests at this moment the impulse of their hearts. And what must forever render you glorious is that you yourself proposed that law, and fixed yourself a limit to our gratitude." End quote. Lafayette had not expected to be made such an offer. His reply, delivered extemporaneously, was printed in the official report of the festival as follows. Quote, "The emotion I experience at this moment, gentlemen, does not allow me to find any expressions adequate to my feelings of gratitude. I have often recalled to you that the National Guards of France assembled here through their deputies ought to present no address but to the nation's assembly and to the king. Judge, therefore, whether I can give my consent to the honorable and touching expression you design to make in my favor. No, gentlemen, permit me to consider it as a testimony of your friendship that you are giving to your Parisian brothers in arms in the person of their commander. As to myself, I concurred with them and you in our glorious revolution. I proclaimed upon the altar of liberty the vow that forever unites all her soldiers. I have been overwhelmed by your kindness. It only remains for me to aspire ardently for that day so rapidly approaching, which, by terminating our constitutional labors, will allow me to devote myself altogether to recollections that will be forever dear to me, since they will recall incessantly my respect, my obligation, my eternal devotion to you." End quote. Once again, Lafayette had declined to take greater power for himself, even when others were practically begging him to. Writing to Governor Maurice, Ambassador Short expressed his view that Lafayette's decision, while admirable in its intent, had the potential to end disastrously both for himself and for the nation. Quote, "The time will come, perhaps, when he will regret not having seized the opportunity of giving such a complexion to the revolution as every good citizen ought to desire. It would have been easy for him to have engaged the National Assembly to have fixed the time for the elections to the next legislature. I fear now that nothing but some crisis which I do not foresee will engage them to do it." End quote. With the benefit of hindsight, Short's assessment of Lafayette's situation post-Federation was quite astute. The Festival of the Federation indeed represents the highest point in Lafayette's career, the zenith of his influence, as Short himself phrased it. The most enduring testament to this particular moment in time is a painting, likely created in either 1790 or 1791 by an anonymous artist, straightforwardly entitled "The Oath of Lafayette at the Festival of the Federation, July 14, 1790. I will now quote at length from author Laura Auricchio's description of this painting, as her words do it justice better than mine would. Quote, "Among the thousands of pieces of revolutionary memorabilia held in the remarkable collections of the Musée Carnavalet, one oil painting epitomizes the week's veneration of Lafayette. The artist, whose identity is unknown, offers a close-up view of the patriotic altar erected on the Champ de Mars, just as Lafayette begins to read the oath to the expectant crowd. Dressed in his blue and white National Guard uniform, Lafayette stands proudly atop the circular platform, his upright posture echoed by the columnar altar in front of him and the triumphal arch in the distance. Talleyrand, in the bishop's mitre, stands a few steps down, in a position so marginal that his robes seem to flow past the picture's rightmost edge. On the left, two fédérés, perhaps the men who had commissioned the painting, gaze directly at the viewer as their companions tilt their heads upward, mouths parted in anticipation of the coming pledge. Lafayette's raised left hand holds a piece of paper, presumably the text of the oath, while he points his sword using his right hand at the base of a small crucifix. Although dark clouds occlude much of the sky, 3 diagonal beams of light streak down through a clear blue patch in the upper left, pointing directly at Lafayette, as though the very forces of nature had conspired to heighten the drama. A gust of wind threatens to topple the red, white, and blue figure of a patriotic altar boy, who struggles to remain upright as his tricolor flag, caught in the wind, pulls him back. Lafayette alone stands effortlessly erect, commanding our attention." End quote. When it was all said and done, there was no denying that the Festival of the Federation had been a symbolic triumph for Lafayette, but his fall from these heights of popular acclaim would be precipitous. The beginning of the end for the general would come sooner than anyone expected. In mid-August 1790, a mutiny occurred among the army garrison in the city of Nancy, in northeastern France. The soldiers had a multiplicity of long-standing grievances against their commanding officers, pertaining mostly to corruption and the unnecessarily harsh discipline the rank-and-file soldiers were subjected to. This took on a political dimension when members of the local Jacobin club encouraged the enlisted men to articulate these grievances, which the officers, who were mostly royalist in their affiliation, failed to adequately address. In retaliation, the soldiers went into open mutiny, arresting their commanding officers, seizing the regimental pay chests, and refusing to return to active duty until their demands were met. The commander of the garrison in the nearby city of Metz, François Claude, the Marquis de Fuye, moved to suppress the mutiny with 4,500 loyal troops. Fuye was a notorious ultra-royalist, and he just so happened to be Lafayette's cousin. The two exchanged letters about how to handle the situation in Nancy. Lafayette was of the opinion that insubordination was unacceptable, and it must be dealt with severely. To quote from one of the letters he wrote to Fuye, quote, "It seems to me, dear cousin, that we ought to strike a blow that might produce an effect on the whole army, and put an end, by one severe example, to the general desertion now in the making." End quote. This disciplinarian approach to leadership was not so out of character for Lafayette as it may seem at first glance. If you'll recall, back in episode 5, during the Virginia campaign of 1781, he had one man hanged in front of the entire regiment for attempting to desert. More recently, in October 1789, he had 2 National Guards hanged for participating in the lynching of a baker. On August 16th, a deputation of soldiers sent by the mutineers arrived in Paris to plead their case before the National Assembly. Lafayette promptly had all of them arrested. That same day, he addressed the assembly himself, urging them to support Fuye in his efforts to suppress the rebellion. Quote, "Monsieur Fuye needs the testimony of our approval, and we must give it to him. I claim this for him, for the obedient troops, and for the National Guards, who were created by liberty and will die for it." End quote. The assembly ultimately voted to give Fuye a free hand, prompting Lafayette to write to his cousin again, quote, "The decree concerning Nancy is good. Its execution must be complete and spirited. Now is the moment, my dear cousin, when we can begin the establishment of constitutional order that must replace revolutionary anarchy. Let us not be discouraged. Let us hope that by uniting all of our forces for the establishment of the Constitution, by steering ourselves against all domestic and foreign difficulties, we will assure liberty and public order at the same time." End quote. Fuye and his troops reached Nancy on August 31st. He issued a demand that the mutinous soldiers release their hostages and stand down. This went over about as well as might be expected. A clash broke out near the city's main gate, and the situation quickly escalated into a full-on battle. After 3 hours of fighting and 500 killed on either side, the mutineers surrendered. Fuye showed little mercy to those he deemed most responsible for the insurrection. 22 of the ringleaders were either shot or hanged. The man identified as the main conspirator was broken on the wheel. Another 41 were sentenced to 3 decades of hard labor, and 74 more were given lengthy prison sentences. Reports of Fuye's suppression of the Nancy mutiny reached Paris 2 days later. Lafayette immediately congratulated his cousin, hailing him as the, quote, "savior of public affairs." End quote. The National Assembly, at Lafayette's behest, likewise voted to issue a statement of congratulations. Fuye's actions were far from meeting with universal acclaim, and were decried in the press. The mutineers were venerated as martyrs for the revolutionary cause, while Fuye became a figure forever reviled as a reactionary butcher. Lafayette's vocal support for his cousin made him the target of popular outrage. Crowds staged demonstrations outside the National Assembly and across Paris protesting the massacres at Nancy and denouncing Lafayette for his complicity, while the radical press published its harshest criticism of the general to date. In the September 15th issue of L'Ami du Peuple, Jean-Paul Marat published a furious screed against Lafayette, accusing him of betraying the revolution. Quote, "That you, a mature and educated man, you so-called patriot to whom our fellow citizens, seduced by the appearance of virtue that you put on, abandoned themselves in such good faith, that you would be willing to move the earth to turn the Parisian militia into an army of praetorians, is an exacerbation of which few party leaders would be capable. It was necessary to love the homeland, but what have you done for her? Far from espousing her cause, we always see you among its mortal enemies, with your soul of mud, fortune having done everything for you, the gods were jealous of your destiny. But to the happiness of being the savior of France, you preferred the dishonorable role of the greedy little courtier, the treacherous trickster, and, to heighten the horror, a vile henchman of despotism." End quote. Marat concluded his open letter by once more issuing a direct challenge to Lafayette, this time demanding he drop his liberal facade once and for all. Quote, "Villain, abandon your cowardly machinations, if you are not completely dead to honor. Or rather, stop deluding yourself. Your trickery will get you nowhere." End quote. Desmoulins denounced Lafayette in the obituary for his friend and fellow revolutionary Élisée Loutzelot, who died after a prolonged illness on September 19th. Quote, "He expired with the name of Lafayette on his lips, looking at him like an ambitious officer who never had a soul large enough to play the role of Washington." End quote. Desmoulins went even further, directly blaming Lafayette for his friend's untimely demise. Quote, "Yes, it is you, Lafayette, who killed him, not by the assassin's dagger or the legal knife of the judge, but by the pain of seeing only the most dangerous enemy of liberty in you, in whom we had placed all of our confidence, and who should be the firmest supporter of freedom." End quote. Even Lafayette's old friend and ally, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, could not withhold his criticism, regretfully reporting that Lafayette had in fact encouraged the Assembly to declare support for Fuye. Brissot commented, quote, "It is difficult for a patriot to believe that he spoke these words." End quote. It was in the latter half of the year 1790, amid fallout from the Nancy Mutiny, that a new highly salacious rumor emerged regarding Lafayette, that he was carrying on an extramarital affair with Queen Marie Antoinette. Needless to say, the veracity of these rumors can be dismissed out of hand. Marie Antoinette felt nothing but enmity towards Lafayette by this point. As I mentioned towards the top of the episode, she was never able to dispel her suspicion that Lafayette was the true instigator behind the Women's March on Versailles, during which she herself very narrowly escaped a horrific death. She remained utterly convinced that Lafayette intended to usurp her husband's throne, and what's more, she resented the degree of power that he now held over her. In a letter written to a confidant just before the Festival of the Federation, the Queen stated, quote, "Everything goes from bad to worse. The minister," meaning Jacques Necker, "and the Marquis de Lafayette take missteps every day. We go along with all of them, and instead of being satisfied, these monsters only become more insolent by the moment." End quote. The intense hatred between Marie Antoinette and Lafayette was readily disregarded once the latter was understood to have betrayed the revolution. Lafayette now became a stock character in a pre-existing genre of satirical illustrations and pamphlets depicting Marie Antoinette in a pornographic manner. I will spare the audience from all the lurid details of these publications, but one can just as easily get a sense of the nature of these works from their titles. Such titles included The Amorous Nights of General Motier and the Beautiful Antoinette, Marie Antoinette in an Awkward Spot, or The Correspondence of Lafayette with the Queen, The Confessions of Marie Antoinette about her loves and intrigues with the Marquis de Lafayette, The Goodbyes of Lafayette to Antoinette, or The Last Correspondence Before Fleeing the Land of Liberty, and The Patriotic Brothel, by the Queen of the French for the pleasures of the deputies of the new legislature. And this was by no means intended to be an exhaustive list. Lafayette, ever conscious of his public image, had made an effort since the beginning of the Revolution to collect copies of any publications concerning himself, regardless of how he was portrayed in them, meaning that he almost certainly saw any number of these obscene writings and prints. In the waning months of the year 1790, Lafayette's star had begun to fade from the peak of brilliance that it had reached at the Festival of the Federation, but not all was lost. He still retained much of the power and influence he had won for himself since the Revolution began. The municipal authorities of Paris still supported him, and though there was some dissent in the ranks of the National Guard, they were, at least for the time being, willing to obey his orders. As he explained in a letter he wrote to General Washington shortly after the Nancy affair, the continued loyalty of the Guard gave him confidence that he would be able to overcome the factional intrigues he now faced. Quote, "Now we are constantly disturbed by revolts among the regiments, and as I myself am constantly attacked on all sides by the aristocrats and the populists, I do not know to which of these parties we owe our current troubles. Our defense against them lies with the National Guard, an army of more than 1,000,000 patriotic citizens. My influence among them remains just as great as if I had accepted the chief command." End quote. Further on in this letter, Lafayette acknowledged that his commitment to upholding law and order had led to him losing some popularity with the mob, as he called them, but he hadn't totally lost hope, at least not yet, that a satisfactory conclusion to the revolution was in sight. Quote, "I hope our business will end with the year, when your friend, this much blackened and ambitious dictator, will happily give up all power, all public concerns, and become a private citizen in a free monarchy." End quote. Still, there was no denying that his involvement in the Nancy affair had dealt a serious blow to his reputation among the revolution's most devoted adherents. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the ever-widening political divide, the Royalists, chief among them the Queen, continued to regard him as a potential usurper and the jailer of the king. On February 1791, he would find himself faced down by both sides during an incident ominously called the Day of Daggers. But to properly explain this part of the story, we'll have to backtrack a bit. In November 1789, the National Assembly voted to approve a measure nationalizing the properties and estates of the Catholic Church in France. Initially proposed by Talleyrand and backed enthusiastically by Mirabeau, this decree was pitched as a way to temporarily resolve the state's perennial budgetary problems. But in reality, it was only the first part of a wider legislative agenda intended to fully subordinate the authority of the Church to the state. To this end, a new law referred to as the Civil Constitution of the Clergy was drafted and passed by the Assembly in June 1790. The Civil Constitution effectively reclassified all clergy as public servants, and like all other public servants, they were now compelled to swear an oath of undivided loyalty to the nation. This oath would be the most contentious of the law's provisions, as the clergy immediately split into opposing camps of jurors and non-jurors, that is, those who took the oath and those who refused. In March 1791, Pope Pius VI formally condemned the Civil Constitution, severed diplomatic relations with France, and threatened to excommunicate any clergy who took the oath. What ensued was a full-blown religious schism, as French clergy and all faithful adherents of Catholicism, by extension, were forced to choose sides. Even before the Civil Constitution went into effect, non-jurate clergy in the provinces urged their parishioners to resist the government with violent force, eventually leading to the outbreak of a massive counter-revolutionary insurgency in the Vendée region of western France in 1793. On a more granular level, the schism's effects could be seen in individual households, Lafayette's included. As we know by now, Lafayette was personally agnostic. Religion had never been a very important part of his life, and as such, he declined to weigh in during the debates on the Civil Constitution. He supported religious tolerance and freedom of worship in principle, and he later wrote that he disapproved of the way that the Civil Constitution was implemented, but once it was passed into law, he was obliged to uphold it. His wife, Adrienne, on the other hand, was a devout Catholic who refused to accept the Civil Constitution. She defied the law openly and, what's more, encouraged others to do the same. She continued to attend Mass regularly at her parish of Saint-Sulpice, even after the priest there publicly announced his refusal to take the civil oath. Her daughter Virginie claimed that Adrienne, quote, went assiduously to the churches where the persecuted clergy took refuge. She encouraged them to exercise their normal functions and claim their right to freedom of worship, end quote. Her actions did not go unnoticed by the public. In the April 21st, 1791 edition of L'Ami du Peuple, Jean-Paul Marat asserted that Adrienne's complicity with the non-jurate clergy was proof that she and her husband were in league with the king, who himself was known to oppose the Civil Constitution. Quote, on the pretext of respecting religious opinions, Louis XVI has authorized the rebel priests of Saint-Sulpice to preach revolt, and Lafayette's wife is their abettor. End quote. She even had gone so far to shelter non-jurate clergy in their house fairly regularly, fugitives from justice who Lafayette should have arrested on the spot. Adrienne's religious convictions put her husband in a difficult position, as Virginie recounts. Quote, my father did not for a moment consider interfering with her, but you can imagine how painful it was for my mother to realize how her actions were eroding his popularity. End quote. Regardless, Adrienne would not back down from her stance, even generating further controversy when Lafayette invited the Bishop of Paris, who had readily sworn the oath, to a dinner at their house. Usually an energetic hostess, Adrienne would not face the bishop, instead sequestering herself in her room and refusing to emerge. As I briefly mentioned, it was widely understood that King Louis XVI opposed the civil constitution. In fact, multiple historians have posited that it was what turned him decisively against the revolution. As Shama explains, quote, "Throughout 1790, Louis remained genuinely uncertain about his political direction, and far less committed to counter-revolution than the Queen was. What finally moved him to abandon any further thought of managing the revolution along the lines suggested by the likes of Mirabeau was the religious question." End quote. From the time when the civil constitution was passed by the Assembly, Louis refrained from signing it into law for 6 entire months, finally being persuaded to do so by high-ranking liberal clergymen on December 26th. This decision seems to have weighed heavily on his conscience, as Shama continues, quote, "The strictures from Rome increasingly troubled him. He still liked to think of himself as His Most Christian Majesty, anointed with the holy ampule at Rheims, the sworn upholder of the apostolic faith. It was only with the gravest misgivings, then, that he signed into law the Assembly's decree giving the clergy of France the choice of being rebels or heretics, disenfranchised or excommunicated. It was surely this act which divided Louis's conduct into a public mask and a private confession." End quote. To elaborate on that last point, it seems that Louis was so anguished by relenting to the pressure on him to sign the decree that he secretly turned to non-jurate priests for spiritual guidance. From here, an open break with the revolution was not far off, and in February 1791 he would be forced to reveal his hand. That month, the king signed passports for 2 of his aunts, Adelaide and Victoire, authorizing them to travel abroad. Ostensibly, the 2 women wanted to make a religious pilgrimage to Rome for the upcoming Easter holiday. Mirabeau had cautioned Louis against allowing his aunts to leave, considering how contentious the subject of religion had become in recent days. Louis did nothing to stop them, and on the 20th, the 2 princesses set off towards Italy. They got about halfway to the border when they were stopped and detained in the town of Arnay-le-Duc. The matter was then brought before the National Assembly, where, predictably, the more radical deputies were entirely disinclined to believe the princesses' intentions were above board. They naturally assumed that this was a pretext for the princesses to surreptitiously escape the country altogether, and as it turned out, there was some truth in this. The Assembly may well have simply revoked the princesses' passports and have that be the end of it, if Mirabeau had not spoken out in defense of the 2 princesses. He argued that freedom of movement was guaranteed by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and that since these 2 women had not violated any law, it was unconstitutional, therefore, to deny them that right. Knowing what we know now about Mirabeau and his shady dealings with the court, one might be inclined to interpret his impassioned plea on behalf of the king's aunts in this light, but, for whatever it's worth, this seems to have been a genuinely held belief of his. Anyway, Mirabeau was able to win over enough of his fellow deputies to grant the princesses their passports, but outside of the Assembly not everyone was as convinced. On the 24th, demonstrators convened outside the Tuileries Palace, intent on petitioning the king to order his aunts to return immediately. Lafayette issued strict orders to the National Guard to not allow anyone entry. Mayor Bailly tried to mediate, asking that a small delegation be allowed an audience with the king, but Lafayette stood firm. After 3 hours, the demonstrators gave up and dispersed. Lafayette's steadfast refusal to permit any entry to the Tuileries whatsoever seemed to many to confirm the existence of a conspiracy of the king to flee Paris with his family. A rumor emerged that there was a secret underground passageway connecting the Tuileries with the Château de Vincennes, a castle just outside the city. On February 28th, a rogue National Guard captain named Antoine-Joseph Santerre led 1,000 laborers from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine to Vincennes. Spurred on by the rumors about a secret underground passage, they intended to demolish the castle to prevent the king's escape. Lafayette immediately took a sizable contingent of the National Guard to Vincennes to quell the disturbance. Once there, they were able to arrest the main culprits and sent the rest back home without the situation devolving into large-scale violence. It took Lafayette quite some time to fully restore the peace, and he was the target of a failed assassination attempt at one point that day, leading to rumors that he had been killed. Meanwhile, in Paris itself, a new threat arose. Lafayette had dispatched such a large proportion of the National Guard to Vincennes that the Tuileries was left practically defenseless. The king's ultra-royalist supporters, at least those few who remained in Paris, feared that Lafayette had just fallen for a Jacobin plot, possibly getting himself killed in the process. that the march on Vincennes was a distraction and that a mob would descend on the palace at any moment. Between 400 and 500 noblemen, all armed primarily with swords and daggers, rushed to the Tuileries to protect the king. The palace chamberlain allowed them to enter directly into the building unmolested, whereupon they surrounded the somewhat bewildered Louis and prepared to defend against the impending Jacobin assault. On learning that hundreds of armed nobles had just occupied the Tuileries, Lafayette assumed that there was some sort of monarchist coup d'etat underway, and he rushed over as quickly as he could. Unceremoniously barging his way into the palace, Lafayette ordered the noblemen to surrender their weapons and disperse, which they refused to do, until the king intervened, thanking the men for their bravery and devotion but begging them to comply with Lafayette's orders. The noblemen begrudgingly handed over their weapons to the National Guard, who allegedly treated them quite roughly, one of them later complaining, quote, "Gentlemen would rather have let themselves be cut to pieces than submit to be treated the way we have been," end quote. And so, February 28, 1791, the Day of Daggers, as it is remembered by history, ended. Lafayette had managed to stave off both a popular uprising and a monarchist coup, all without significant bloodshed, but his actions that day did not win him any respect from either the left or the right. In a letter he wrote to Washington a week later, Lafayette bemoaned the seemingly impossible position he found himself in. Quote, "My dear General, whatever expectations I conceived of a speedy termination to our revolutionary troubles, I am still tossed about in the oceans of factions and commotions of every kind, for it is my fate to be attacked with equal animosity from every side, on one side by the aristocrats who are enemies to my leveling doctrine, and on the other by anti-royal, licentious, and pillaging factions of all kinds, so that my personal escape from amidst so many hostile bands appears rather dubious indeed." End quote. His optimism was gone. Lafayette could sense that things were about to go from bad to worse, though how exactly, he could not know. In a missive to the king, Mirabeau predicted the downfall of the hero of two worlds with remarkable accuracy. Quote, "To speak only of an event easy to foresee, one day the Marquis de Lafayette will open fire on the people, and by that alone he will mortally wound himself." End quote. But I'm afraid you'll have to tune in again next time to hear what happens as we cover the climactic events of the flight to Varennes and the subsequent massacre at the Champ de Mars. In the meantime, please feel free to direct any and all questions, comments, or concerns to my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach me on Twitter or Facebook, as well as the show's website, links to all of which will be in the episode description. To briefly circle back to the announcement that I made at the top of the show, if you have any suggestions regarding potential new bonus content on the Patreon page I plan to restart later this year, I encourage you to send them my way. For now, you can support the show by rating and reviewing it on your podcast listening platform of choice, or by purchasing some used books from me on eBay. Anyway, that will be all for now. This has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, William Connor, signing off.
Le clergé regrette le bien qu'il a, par justice la nation l'aura, par le prudent Lafayette, tout trouble s'apaisera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, réjouissons-nous, le bon temps viendra. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, par les flambeaux de l'auguste assemblée. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, le peuple abri toujours se gardera. Le vrai d'avec le faux l'on connaîtra, le citoyen pour le bien soutiendra. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au début ira, sans avoir à le troubler, toujours le plus